Of all Mr. Pickwick's many adventures and encounters, none was more important and revealing than his encounter with the law. It all begins, quite early in the story, with a completely innocent misunderstanding, and on the very day that Mr. Pickwick engaged the services of the faithful Sam Weller.
Mr. Pickwick's apartments in Goswell Street, although on a limited scale, were not only of a very neat and comfortable description, but peculiarly adapted for the residence of a man of his genius and observation. His sitting room was the first floor front, his bedroom the second floor front, and thus, whether he was sitting at his desk in his parlour or standing before the dressing-glass in his dormitory, he had an equal opportunity of contemplating human nature in all the numerous phases it exhibits, in that not more populous than popular thoroughfare. His landlady, Mrs. Bardell, the relict and sole executrix of a deceased custom-house officer, was a comely woman of bustling manners and agreeable appearance, with a natural genius for cooking, improved by study and long practice into an exquisite talent. There were no children, no servants, no fowls. The only other inmates of the house were a large man and a small boy. The first a lodger, the second a production of Mrs. Bardell's. Cleanliness and quiet reigned throughout the house, and in it Mr. Pickwick's will was law. To anyone acquainted with these points of the domestic economy of the establishment, and conversant with the admirable regulation of Mr. Pickwick's mind, his appearance and behaviour on this morning would have been most mysterious and unaccountable. He paced the room to and fro with hurried steps, popped his head out of the window at intervals of about 3 minutes each, constantly referred to his watch, and exhibited many other manifestations of impatience, very unusual with him. It was evident that something of great importance was in contemplation, but what that something was, not even Mrs. Bardell herself had been able to discover. "Mrs. Bardell," said Mr. Pickwick at last, as that amiable female approached the termination of a prolonged dusting of the apartment. "Sir," said Mrs. Bardell, "do you think it a much greater expense to keep 2 people than to keep 1? "La, Mr. Pickwick," said Mrs. Bardell, colouring up to the very border of her cap, as she fancied she observed a species of matrimonial twinkle in the eyes of her lodger. "La, Mr. Pickwick, what a question!" "Well, but do you?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "That depends," said Mrs. Bardell, approaching the duster very near to Mr. Pickwick's elbow, which was planted on the table. "That depends a good deal upon the person, you know, Mr. Pickwick, and whether it's a saving and careful person, sir." "That's very true," said Mr. Pickwick, "but the person I have in my eye," here he looked very hard at Mrs. Bardell, "I think possesses these qualities, and has, moreover, a considerable knowledge of the world, and a great deal of sharpness, Mrs. Bardell, which may be of material use to me." "La, Mr. Pickwick," said Mrs. Bardell, the crimson rising to her cap border again. "I do," said Mr. Pickwick, growing energetic, as was his wont in speaking of a subject which interested him. "I do indeed, and to tell you the truth, Mrs. Bardell, I have made up my mind." "Dear me, sir," exclaimed Mrs. Bardell. "You will think it very strange now," said the amiable Mr. Pickwick, with a good-humoured glance at his companion, "that I have never consulted you about this matter, and never mentioned it, till I sent your little boy out this morning." Mrs. Bardell could only reply by a look. She had long worshipped Mr. Pickwick at a distance, but here she was, all at once, raised to a pinnacle to which her wildest and most extravagant hopes had never dared to aspire. Mr. Pickwick was going to propose. A deliberate plan, too. Sent her little boy to the borough to get him out of the way. Oh, how thoughtful, how considerate. "Well," said Mr. Pickwick, "what do you think?" "Oh, Mr. Pickwick," said Mrs. Bardell, trembling with agitation, "you're very kind, sir." "It'll save you a good deal of trouble, won't it?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Oh, I never thought of anything of the trouble, sir," replied Mrs. Bardell, "and, of course, I should take more trouble to please you than ever. But it's so kind of you, Mr. Pickwick, to have so much consideration for my loneliness." "Ah, to be sure," said Mr. Pickwick, "I never thought of that. When I'm in town, you will always have someone to sit with you. To be sure, sir, you will." "I'm sure I ought to be a very happy woman," said Mrs. Bardell. "And your little boy," said Mr. Pickwick. "Bless his heart," interposed Mrs. Bardell, with a maternal sob. "He, too, will have a companion," resumed Mr. Pickwick. "A lively one who'll teach him, I'll be bound, more tricks in a week than he'd ever learn in a year." And Mr. Pickwick smiled placidly. "Oh, you dear," said Mrs. Bardell. Mr. Pickwick started. "Oh, you kind, good, playful dear," said Mrs. Bardell. And without more ado, she rose from her chair and flung her arms round Mr. Pickwick's neck with a cataract of tears and a chorus of sobs. "Bless my soul," cried the astonished Mr. Pickwick. "Mrs. Bardell, my good woman. Dear me, what a situation, pray consider. Mrs. Bardell, don't, if anyone should come in." "Oh, let them come," exclaimed Mrs. Bardell frantically. "I'll never leave you, dear, kind, good soul." And with these words, Mrs. Bardell clung the tighter. "Mercy upon me," said Mr. Pickwick, struggling violently. "I hear someone coming on the stairs. Don't, there's a good creature, don't." But entreaty and remonstrance were alike unavailing, for Mrs. Bardell had fainted in Mr. Pickwick's arms. And before he could gain time to deposit her on a chair, Master Bardell entered the room, ushering in Mr. Tupman, Mr. Winkle, and Mr. Snodgrass. Mr. Pickwick was struck motionless and speechless. He stood, with his lovely burden in his arms, gazing vacantly on the countenances of his friends, without the slightest attempt at recognition or explanation. They, in their turn, stared at him, and Master Bardell, in his turn, stared at everybody. The astonishment of the Pickwickians was so absorbing, and the perplexity of Mr. Pickwick so extreme, that they might have remained in exactly the same relative situations until the suspended animation of the lady was restored, had it not been for a most beautiful and touching expression of filial affection on the part of her youthful son. Clad in a tight suit of corduroy, spangled with brass buttons of a very considerable size, he at first stood at the door astounded and uncertain, but by degrees the impression that his mother must have suffered some personal damage pervaded his partially developed mind, and considering Mr. Pickwick as the aggressor, he set up an appalling and semi-earthly kind of howling, and butting forward with his head, commenced assailing that immortal gentleman about the back and legs with such blows and pinches as the strength of his arms and the violence of his excitement allowed. "Take this little villain away," said the agonized Mr. Pickwick. "He's mad." "What is the matter?" said the three tongue-tied Pickwickians. "I don't know," replied Mr. Pickwick pettishly. "Take away the boy." Here Mr. Winkle carried the interesting boy, screaming and struggling, to the farther end of the apartment. "Now help me lead this woman downstairs." "Oh, I'm better now," said Mrs. Bardell faintly. "Let me lead you downstairs," said the ever-gallant Mr. Tupman. "Thank you, sir, thank you," exclaimed Mrs. Bardell hysterically, and down the stairs she was led accordingly, accompanied by her affectionate son. "I cannot conceive," said Mr. Pickwick when his friends returned, "I cannot conceive what has been the matter with that woman. I had merely announced to her my intention of keeping a manservant, when she fell into the extraordinary paroxysms in which you found her. Very extraordinary thing?" "Very," said his three friends. "Placed me in such an extremely awkward situation," continued Mr. Pickwick. "Very," was the reply of his followers, as they coughed slightly and looked dubiously at one another. This behavior was not lost upon Mr. Pickwick. He remarked their incredulity. They evidently suspected him. "There is a man in the passage now," said Mr. Tupman. "It's the man I spoke to you about," said Mr. Pickwick. "I sent for him up to the borough this morning. Have the goodness to call him up, Snodgrass." Mr. Snodgrass did as he was desired, and Mr. Samuel Weller forthwith presented himself. "Oh, you remember me, I suppose," said Mr. Pickwick. "I should think so," replied Sam, with a patronizing wink. "Sit down," said Mr. Pickwick. "Thank you, sir," said Sam, and down he sat without further bidding, having previously deposited his old white hat on the landing outside the door. "Don't a werry good un to look at," said Sam, "but it's an astonishing un to wear, and afore the broom went it were a werry handsome tile. Howsoever, it's lighter without it, and that's one thing, and every hole lets in some air, that's another. Wentilation gossamer, I calls it." On the delivery of this sentiment, Mr. Weller smiled agreeably upon the assembled Pickwickians. "Now, with regard to the matter on which I, with the concurrence of these gentlemen, sent for you," said Mr. Pickwick. "That's the pint, sir," interposed Sam. "Out with it, as the father said to the child when he swallowed a farden." "We want to know, in the first place," said Mr. Pickwick, "whether you have any reason to be discontented with your present situation." "Afore I answers that there question, gentlemen," replied Mr. Weller, "I should like to know, in the first place, whether you're going to provide me with a better." A sunbeam of placid benevolence played on Mr. Pickwick's features as he said, "I've half made up my mind to engage you myself." "Have you, though?" said Sam. Mr. Pickwick nodded in the affirmative. "Wages?" said Sam. £12 a year," replied Mr. Pickwick. "Clothes?" 2 suits. "Work?" "To attend upon me, and to travel about with me and these gentlemen here." "Take the bill down," said Sam emphatically. "I'm let to a single gentleman, and the terms is agreed on."
Mr. Pickwick, with his 3 companions and Sam, went off on his travels and thought no more about the incident. But Mrs. Bardell did not forget, and finally she was persuaded by a pair of unscrupulous lawyers, Messrs. Dodson and Fogg, to sue Mr. Pickwick for breach of promise. After many delays, the court hearing begins.
"Bardell and Pickwick," cried the gentleman in black, calling on the case which stood first on the list. "I am for the plaintiff, my lord," said Mr. Sergeant Buzzfuzz. "Who is with you, brother Buzzfuzz?" said the judge. Mr. Skimpin bowed to intimate that he was. "I appear for the defendant, my lord," said Mr. Sergeant Snubbin. "Anybody with you, brother Snubbin?" inquired the court. "Mr. Funky, my lord," replied Sergeant Snubbin. "Sergeant Buzzfuzz and Mr. Skimpin for the plaintiff," said the judge, writing down the names in his notebook and reading as he wrote. "For the defendant, Sergeant Snubbin and Mr. Monkey." "Beg your lordship's pardon, Funky." "Oh, very good," said the judge. "I never had the pleasure of hearing the gentleman's name before." Here Mr. Funky bowed and smiled, and the judge bowed and smiled too. And then Mr. Funky, blushing into the very whites of his eyes, tried to look as if he didn't know that everybody was gazing at him, a thing which no man ever succeeded in doing yet, or in all reasonable probability ever will. "Go on," said the judge. The ushers again called silence, and Mr. Skimpin proceeded to open the case. And the case appeared to have very little inside it when he had opened it, for he kept such particulars as he knew completely to himself, and sat down after a lapse of 3 minutes, leaving the jury in precisely the same advanced stage of wisdom as they were in before. Sergeant Buzzfuzz then rose, with all the majesty and dignity which the grave nature of the proceedings demanded, and having whispered to Dodson and conferred briefly with Fogg, pulled his gown over his shoulders, settled his wig, and addressed the jury. Sergeant Buzzfuzz began by saying that never, in the whole course of his professional experience, never, from the very first moment of his applying himself to the study and practice of the law, had he approached a case with feelings of such deep emotion or with such a heavy sense of the responsibility imposed upon him. A responsibility, he would say, which he could never have supported were he not buoyed up and sustained by a conviction so strong that it amounted to positive certainty that the cause of truth and justice, or in other words, the cause of his much injured and most oppressed client, must prevail with the high-minded and intelligent dozen of men whom he now saw in that box before him. "You have heard from my learned friend, gentlemen," continued Sergeant Buzzfuzz, well knowing that from the learned friend alluded to, the gentlemen of the jury had heard just nothing at all. "You have heard from my learned friend, gentlemen, that this is an action for a breach of promise of marriage in which the damages are laid at £1,500. But you have not heard from my learned friend, inasmuch as it did not come within my learned friend's province to tell you, what are the facts and circumstances of the case. Those facts and circumstances, gentlemen, you shall hear detailed by me and proved by the unimpeachable female whom I will place in that box before you." Here Mr. Sergeant Buzzfuzz, with a tremendous emphasis on the word box, smote his table with a mighty sound and glanced at Dodson and Fogg, who nodded admiration of the sergeant an indignant defiance of the defendant. "The plaintiff, gentlemen," continued Sergeant Buzzfuzz in a soft and melancholy voice, "the plaintiff is a widow. Yes, gentlemen, a widow. The late Mr. Bardell, after enjoying for many years the esteem and confidence of his sovereign as one of the guardians of his royal revenues, glided almost imperceptibly from the world to seek elsewhere for that repose and peace which a custom-house officer can never afford." At this pathetic description of the decease of Mr. Bardell, who had been knocked on the head with a quart pot in a public-house cellar, the learned sergeant's voice faltered, and he proceeded with emotion. "Some time before his death, he had stamped his likeness upon a little boy. With this boy, the only pledge of her departed exciseman, Mrs. Bardell shrunk from the world and courted the retirement and tranquillity of Goswell Street. And here she placed in her front parlour window a written placard bearing this inscription: 'Apartments furnished for a single gentleman. Inquire within.'" Here Sergeant Buzzfuzz paused, while several gentlemen of the jury took a note of the document. "There is no date to that, is there, sir?" inquired a juror. "There is no date, gentlemen," replied Sergeant Buzzfuzz, "but I am instructed to say that it was put in the plaintiff's parlour window just this time 3 years. I entreat the attention of the jury to the wording of this document. Apartments furnished for a single gentleman." Mrs. Bardell's opinion of the opposite-sex gentleman were derived from a long contemplation of the inestimable qualities of her lost husband. She had no fear. She had no distrust. She had no suspicion. All was confidence and reliance. "Mr. Bardell," said the widow, "Mr. Bardell was a man of honour. Mr. Bardell was a man of his word. Mr. Bardell was no deceiver. Mr. Bardell was once a single gentleman himself. To single gentlemen I look for protection, for assistance, for comfort and for consolation. In single gentlemen I shall perpetually see something to remind me of what Mr. Bardell was, when he first won my young and untried affections. To a single gentleman, then, shall my lodgings be let." Actuated by this beautiful and touching impulse, among the best impulses of our imperfect nature, gentlemen, the lonely and desolate widow dried her tears, furnished her first floor, caught the innocent boy to her maternal bosom, and put the bill up in her parlour window. Did it remain there long? No. The serpent was on the watch. Before the bill had been in the parlour window 3 days, 3 days, gentlemen, a being, erect upon 2 legs and bearing all the outward semblance of a man, and not of a monster, knocked on the door of Mrs. Bardell's house. He inquired within, he took the lodgings, and on the very next day he entered into possession of them. This man was Pickwick. Pickwick, the defendant. Sergeant Buzzfuzz, who had proceeded with such volubility that his face was perfectly crimson, here paused for breath. The silence awoke Mr. Justice Starley, who immediately wrote down something with a pen without any ink in it, and looked unusually profound, to impress the jury with the belief that he always thought most deeply with his eyes shut. Sergeant Buzzfuzz proceeded. "Of this man Pickwick I will say little. The subject presents but few attractions, and I, gentlemen, am not the man, nor are you, gentlemen, the men, to delight in the contemplation of revolting heartlessness and systematic villainy." Here Mr. Pickwick, who had been writhing in silence for some time, gave a violent start, as if some vague idea of assaulting Sergeant Buzzfuzz in the august presence of justice and law suggested itself to his mind. "I say systematic villainy, gentlemen," said Sergeant Buzzfuzz, looking through Mr. Pickwick and talking at him. "And when I say systematic villainy, let me tell the defendant Pickwick, if he be in court, as I am informed that he is, that it would have been more decent in him, more becoming, in better judgment and in better taste, if he had stopped away. Let me tell him, gentlemen, that any gestures of dissent or disapprobation in which he may indulge in this court will not go down with you, and that you will know how to value and how to appreciate them. And let me tell him further, as my lord will tell you, gentlemen, that a counsel, in the discharge of his duty to his client, is neither to be intimidated or bullied, nor put down, and that any attempt to do either, the one or the other, or the first or the last, will recoil on the head of the attempter, be he plaintiff or be he defendant, be his name Pickwick or Noakes or Stokes or Stiles or Brown or Thompson. This little divergence from the subject in hand had, of course, the intended effect of turning all eyes on Mr. Pickwick. Sergeant Buzzfuzz, having partially recovered from the state of moral elevation into which he had lashed himself, resumed. I shall show you, gentlemen, that for 2 years Pickwick continued to reside constantly and without interruption or intermission at Mrs. Bardell's house. I shall show you that Mrs. Bardell, during the whole of that time, waited on him, attended to his comforts, cooked his meals, looked out his linen for the washerwoman when it went abroad, darned, aired, and prepared it for wear when it came home, and, in short, enjoyed his fullest trust and confidence. I shall prove to you, gentlemen, that about a year ago Pickwick suddenly began to absent himself from home during long intervals, as if with the intention of gradually breaking off from my client. But I shall show you also that his resolution was not at that time sufficiently strong, or that his better feelings conquered, if better feelings he has, or that the charms and accomplishments of my client prevailed against his unmanly intentions, by proving to you that on one occasion, when he returned from the country, he distinctly and in terms offered her marriage, previously, however, taking special care that there should be no witness to their solemn contract. And I am in a situation to prove to you, on the testimony of 3 of his friends, most unwilling witnesses, gentlemen, most unwilling witnesses, that on that morning he was discovered by them holding the plaintiff in his arms and soothing her agitation by his caresses and endearments. A visible impression was produced upon the auditors by this part of the learned sergeant's address. Drawing forth 2 very small scraps of paper, he proceeded. And now, gentlemen, but 1 word more. 2 letters have passed between these parties. Letters which are admitted to be in the handwriting of the defendant, and which speak volumes indeed. These letters bespeak the character of the man. They are not open, fervent, eloquent epistles, breathing nothing but the language of affectionate attachment. They are covert, sly, underhanded communications, but, fortunately, far more conclusive than if couched in the most glowing language and the most poetic imagery. Letters that must be viewed with a cautious and suspicious eye. Letters that were evidently intended at the time by Pickwick to mislead and delude any third parties into whose hands they might fall. Let me read the first. Garraway's, 12 o'clock. Dear Mrs. B, chops and tomato sauce, yours, Pickwick. Gentlemen, what does this mean? Chops and tomato sauce, yours, Pickwick. Chops! Gracious heavens, and tomato sauce! Gentlemen, is the happiness of a sensitive and confiding female to be trifled away by such shallow artifices as these? The next has no date whatever, which is in itself suspicious. Dear Mrs. B, I shall not be home till tomorrow, slow coach. And then follows this very remarkable expression. Don't trouble yourself about the warming pan. The warming pan. Why, gentlemen, who does trouble himself about a warming pan? When was the peace of mind of a man or woman broken or disturbed by a warming pan, which is in itself a harmless, a useful, and I will add, gentlemen, a comforting article of domestic furniture? Why is Mrs. Bardell so earnestly entreated not to agitate herself about this warming pan unless, as is no doubt the case, it is a mere cover for hidden fire, a mere substitute for some endearing word or promise, artfully contrived by Pickwick with a view to his contemplated desertion, and which I am not in a condition to explain. And what does this allusion to the slow coach mean? For aught I know, it may be a reference to Pickwick himself, who has most unquestionably been a criminally slow coach during the whole of this transaction, but whose speed will now be very unexpectedly accelerated, and whose wheels, gentlemen, as he will find to his cost, will very soon be greased by you. But enough of this, gentlemen, said Mr. Sergeant Buzfuz. It is difficult to smile with an aching heart. It is ill jesting when our deepest sympathies are awakened. My client's hopes and prospects are ruined, and it is no figure of speech to say that her occupation is gone indeed. The bill is down, but there is no tenant. Eligible single gentlemen pass and repass, but there is no invitation for them to inquire within or without. All is gloom and silence in the house. Even the voice of the child is hushed. His infant sports are disregarded when his mother weeps. But Pickwick, gentlemen, Pickwick, the ruthless destroyer of this domestic oasis in the desert of Goswell Street, Pickwick, who has choked up the well and thrown ashes on the sward, Pickwick, who comes before you today with his heartless tomato sauce and warming pans, Pickwick still rears his head with unblushing effrontery and gazes without a sigh on the ruin he has made. Damages, gentlemen, heavy damages, is the only punishment with which you can visit him, the only recompense you can award to my client. And for those damages she now appeals to an enlightened, a high-minded, a right-feeling, a conscientious, a dispassionate, a sympathizing, a contemplative jury of her civilized countrymen. With this beautiful peroration, Mr. Sergeant Buzfuz sat down, and Mr. Justice Starley woke up.
Call Nathaniel Winkle, said Mr. Skimpin.
Here, replied a feeble voice. Mr. Winkle entered the witness box, and having duly been sworn, bowed to the judge with considerable deference.
Don't look at me, sir, said the judge sharply, in acknowledgment of the salute. Look at the jury.
Mr. Winkle obeyed the mandate, and looked at the place where he thought it most probable the jury might be, for seeing anything in his then state of intellectual complication was wholly out of the question. Mr. Winkle was then examined by Mr. Skimpin, who, being a promising young man of 2 or 43, was, of course, anxious to confuse a witness who was notoriously predisposed in favour of the other side, as much as he could.
Now, sir, said Mr. Skimpin, have the goodness to let his lordship and the jury know what your name is, will you?
And Mr. Skimpin inclined his head on one side to listen with great sharpness to the answer, and glanced at the jury meanwhile, as if to imply that he rather expected Mr. Winkle's natural taste for perjury would induce him to give some name which did not belong to him.
Winkle, replied the witness.
What's your Christian name, sir? Angrily inquired the little judge.
Nathaniel, sir.
Daniel? Any other name?
Nathaniel, sir. My lord, I mean.
Nathaniel Daniel or Daniel Nathaniel?
No, my lord, only Nathaniel, not Daniel at all.
What did you tell me it was Daniel for, then, sir? Inquired the judge.
I didn't, my lord, replied Mr. Winkle.
You did, sir? Replied the judge with a severe frown. How could I have got Daniel on my notes unless you told me so, sir?
This argument was, of course, unanswerable. Mr. Winkle has rather a short memory, my lord, interposed Mr. Skimpin, with another glance at the jury. We shall find means to refresh it before we've quite done with him, I dare say.
You'd better be careful, sir, said the little judge with a sinister look at the witness.
Poor Mr. Winkle bowed, and endeavoured to feign an easiness of manner which, in his then state of confusion, gave him rather the air of a disconcerted pickpocket. "Now, Mr. Winkle," said Mr. Skimpin, "attend to me, if you please, and let me recommend you, for your own sake, to bear in mind his lordship's injunction to be careful. I believe you are a particular friend of Pickwick, the defendant, are you not?" "I have known Mr. Pickwick now, as well as I recollect at this moment, nearly—" "Pray, Mr. Winkle, do not evade the question. Are you or are you not a particular friend of the defendant's?" "I was just about to say that—" "Will you or will you not answer my question, sir?" "If you don't answer the question, you'll be committed, sir," interposed the little judge, looking over his notebook. "Come, sir," said Mr. Skimpin, "yes or no, if you please." "Yes, I am," replied Mr. Winkle. "Yes, you are. And why couldn't you say that at once, sir? Perhaps you know the plaintiff too, eh, Mr. Winkle?" "I don't know her. I've seen her." "Oh, you don't know her, but you've seen her. Now, have the goodness to tell the gentlemen of the jury what you mean by that, Mr. Winkle." "I mean that I'm not intimate with her, but I have seen her when I went to call on Mr. Pickwick in Goswell Street." "Pray, Mr. Winkle, do you remember calling on the defendant Pickwick at these apartments in the plaintiff's house in Goswell Street on one particular morning in the month of July last?" "Yes, I do." "Were you accompanied on that occasion by a friend of the name of Tupman and another of the name of Snodgrass?" "Yes, I was." "Are they here?" "Yes, they are," replied Mr. Winkle, looking very earnestly towards the spot where his friends were stationed. "Pray attend to me, Mr. Winkle, and never mind your friends," said Mr. Skimpin, with another expressive look at the jury. "They must tell their stories without any previous consultation with you, if none has yet taken place." Another look at the jury. "Now, sir, tell the gentlemen of the jury what you saw on entering the defendant's room on this particular morning. Come, out with it, sir. We must have it sooner or later." "The defendant, Mr. Pickwick, was holding the plaintiff in his arms with his hand clasping her waist," replied Mr. Winkle with natural hesitation, "and the plaintiff appeared to have fainted away." "Did you hear the defendant say anything?" "I heard him call Mrs. Bardell a good creature, and I heard him ask her to compose herself, for what a situation it was if anyone should come, or words to that effect." "Now, Mr. Winkle, I have only one more question to ask you, and I beg you to bear in mind his lordship's caution. Will you undertake to swear that Pickwick, the defendant, did not say on the occasion in question, 'My dear Mrs. Bardell, you're a good creature, compose yourself to this situation, for to this situation you must come,' or words to that effect?" I didn't understand him so, certainly," said Mr. Winkle, astounded at this ingenious dovetailing of the few words he'd heard. "I was on the staircase and couldn't hear distinctly. The impression on my mind is—" "The gentlemen of the jury want none of the impressions on your mind, Mr. Winkle, which I fear would be of little service to honest, straightforward men," interposed Mr. Skimpin. "You were on the staircase and didn't distinctly hear, but you will not swear that Pickwick did not make use of the expressions I have quoted. Do I understand that?" "No, I will not," replied Mr. Winkle, and down sat Mr. Skimpin with a triumphant countenance. Mr. Pickwick's case had not gone off in so particularly happy a manner up to this point that it could well afford to have any additional suspicion cast upon it. But as it could afford to be placed in a rather better light, if possible, Mr. Funky rose for the purpose of getting something important out of Mr. Winkle in cross-examination. "I believe, Mr. Winkle," said Mr. Funky, "that Mr. Pickwick is not a young man." "Oh, no," replied Mr. Winkle, "old enough to be my father." "You have told my learned friend that you have known Mr. Pickwick a long time. Had you ever any reason to suppose or believe that he was about to be married?" "Oh, no, certainly not," replied Mr. Winkle, with so much eagerness that Mr. Funky ought to have got him out of the box with all possible dispatch. Lawyers hold that there are two kinds of particularly bad witness, a reluctant witness and a too willing witness. It was Mr. Winkle's fate to figure in both characters. "I will even go further than this, Mr. Winkle," continued Mr. Funky in a most smooth and complacent manner,
Did you ever see anything in Mr. Pickwick's manner and conduct towards the opposite sex to induce you to believe that he ever contemplated matrimony of late years? In any case? Oh, no, certainly not, replied Mr. Winkle. You have never known anything in his behaviour towards Mrs. Bardell or any other female in the least degree suspicious? Said Mr. Funky, preparing to sit down, for Sergeant Snubbin was winking at him. No, replied Mr. Winkle, except on one trifling occasion which I have no doubt might easily be explained. The moment the words fell from Mr. Winkle's lips, Mr. Funky sat down, and Sergeant Snubbin rather hastily told him he might leave the box, which Mr. Winkle prepared to do with great readiness, when Sergeant Buzzfuzz stopped him. "Stay, Mr. Winkle, stay," said Sergeant Buzzfuzz. "Will your lordship have the goodness to ask him what this one instance of suspicious behaviour towards females on the part of this gentleman who is old enough to be his father was?" Amid the profound silence of the whole court, Mr. Winkle faltered out that the trifling circumstance of suspicion was Mr. Pickwick's being found in a lady's sleeping apartment at midnight, which had terminated, he believed, in the breaking off of the projected marriage of the lady in question, and had led, he knew, to the whole party being forcibly carried before George Nupkins, Esquire, Magistrate and Justice of the Peace for the borough of Ipswich. "You may leave the box, sir," said Sergeant Snubbin. Mr. Winkle did leave the box, and rushed with delirious haste to the George and Vulture, where he was discovered some hours after by the waiter, groaning in a hollow and dismal manner with his head buried beneath the sofa cushions. Mr. Justice Starley summed up, in the old established and most approved form. He read as much of his notes to the jury as he could decipher on so short a notice, and made running comments on the evidence as he went along. If Mrs. Bardell were right, it was perfectly clear that Mr. Pickwick was wrong. If they were satisfied that a breach of promise of marriage had been committed, they would fine for the plaintiff with such damages as they thought proper. And if, on the other hand, it appeared to them that no promise of marriage had ever been given, they would fine for the defendant with no damages at all. The jury then retired to their private room to talk the matter over, and the judge retired to his private room to refresh himself with a mutton chop and a glass of sherry. An anxious quarter of an hour elapsed. The jury came back. The judge was fetched in. Mr. Pickwick put on his spectacles and gazed at the foreman with an agitated countenance and a quickly beating heart. "Gentlemen," said the individual in black, "are you all agreed upon your verdict?" "We are," replied the foreman. "Do you find for the plaintiff, gentlemen, or for the defendant?" "For the plaintiff." "With what damages, gentlemen?" £750. Mr. Pickwick took off his spectacles, carefully wiped the glasses, folded them in their case, and put them in his pocket. Then, having drawn on his gloves with great nicety, and stared at the foreman all the while, he mechanically followed his solicitor, Mr. Perker, and the blue bag out of court. They stopped in a side room while Perker paid the court fees, and here Mr. Pickwick was joined by his friends. Here, too, he encountered Messrs. Dodson and Fogg, rubbing their hands with every token of outward satisfaction. "Well, gentlemen," said Mr. Pickwick. "Well, sir," said Dodson, "for self and partner." "You imagine you'll get your costs, don't you, gentlemen?" said Mr. Pickwick. Fogg said they thought it rather probable. Dodson smiled and said they'd try. "You may try and try and try again, Messrs. Dodson and Fogg," said Mr. Pickwick vehemently, "but not one farthing of costs or damages do you ever get from me if I spend the rest of my existence in a debtor's prison."
Mr. Pickwick was as good as his word. He would not pay the money, and so he was sent to the Fleet prison. After a few weeks, Mrs. Bardell is sent to prison as well, by her own lawyers, Dodson and Fogg, because she owes them their costs. Mrs. Bardell is very contrite by now. She asks Mr. Pickwick's pardon and gives him a letter saying the charge against him was false, and in return he pays the legal costs for her, and they both leave prison. After 2 years of travel and adventure, Mr. Pickwick and his friends decide to separate and settle down. Mr. Winkle and Mr. Snodgrass are both married by now, and Mr. Pickwick, attended as always by Sam Weller, takes a house at Dulwich in London to enjoy a quieter life, but one rich with all the friendships he made on his many travels.